Everyone, and welcome to this Foundation Years video podcast. Our goal with these podcasts is to cover issues that we know are of real importance to the early years sector, and we know that the funding arrangements are absolutely top of this list. The main focus of this podcast will be the early years funding arrangements, and in particular the interaction between the Dedicated Schools Grant and the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. We know that these are issues that you've wanted further guidance on, so we hope we'll be able to provide the answers you need on this podcast. We also encourage you to use this podcast alongside the guidance that the Department for Education has published. So, my name is Matthew Dodd and I'm Head of Policy at the National Children's Bureau, and I am delighted to be chairing this podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Emily Arch, Head of Early Years Funding at the Department for Education, who will be delivering a presentation on the new early years funding arrangements developed in response to COVID-19. We'll have 3 question and answer breaks where we will put the questions that you have already submitted to the Foundation Years inbox to Emily. We received a lot of questions, so we may not be able to cover all of them in the podcast, but we've selected the most common questions from both local authorities and providers. Where Emily has already covered a question in the presentation, we won't ask her to repeat herself, but we will aim to ensure that all the questions get answered one way or another. If you're watching this podcast and you are not already a member of the Foundation Years community, then please visit the Foundation Years website to sign up for information on future vodcasts and regular updates from the DFE and elsewhere. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for the incredible hard work and dedication you are showing at this very, very difficult time to keep provision open for the children of key workers and children who are vulnerable. The response from the early years sector is of absolute national importance, and we are very aware of the significant challenges and sacrifices that you're all making at the moment to keep that provision going. Thank you. We also know that discussions about funding are particularly challenging at the moment, and that you have very real concerns about the interaction between the different funding arrangements. Our role is to help you get the clarity you need to do your job. We also want to recognise the hard work and commitment of all the officials at the Department for Education and across government who are working flat out to get you the clarity and the answers that you need. Very quickly, as the Department for Education's early years stakeholder engagement partner, NCB runs the Foundation Years communication channels to keep you up to date with the latest policy developments and provide you with opportunities to share your views and questions with DFE. You can follow us on Twitter, you can sign up to the Foundation Years mailing list, and once we're back up and running, you can join our regional Learn, Explore, Debate events in the autumn, I hope. We're a champion for early years professionals and the great work that you do. A key part of our role is helping you to have a dialogue with DFE and get your concerns addressed. So without further ado, I will hand over to Emily Arch from the Department for Education. She will do the first part of her presentation, and then we'll do some the first session of question and answers. Thank you for joining us, Emily, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to have the opportunity just to be able to explain some of this a bit further. This has been a really difficult and stressful time for everybody, and we are really aware of that within the department. The uncertainty of this whole situation is really hard for everyone to handle, and I hope what I can do here is answer a few questions at least. I'm going to move through to the introduction slide, if that's okay, please. The government's primary aim for early years at the moment is to make sure that there is enough childcare for vulnerable children and the children of critical workers during this phase of the crisis. And as you'll know, there's been a huge range of support for all sorts of businesses that's been announced. Now, we got in quite early to announce the continuation of DSG funding, the funding that DFE provides to local authorities for the free entitlement. And the nature of this sort of rapid response in a crisis have meant things have been hard to keep up with. It's worth saying DFE has been in regular contact with the sector representative bodies and small groups of councils, and we've been talking lots of these issues through as we have been developing and evolving them. We're not just sitting in isolation and doing this stuff without any more communication. So what I want to explain today is one of the extra tools which we have, which we really released this guidance on, which is a tool for local authorities to help them to ensure that they can secure that childcare for those vulnerable children and children of critical workers. That's the ability to move government funding around, to move DSG around. It is intended only as a last resort for local authorities, and the guidance is clear that when local authorities are making their decisions, they should be talking to their local providers, and they should be keeping in mind, as well as those aims that I've talked about of the childcare, they should be keeping in mind the financial sustainability of the early years sector. Next slide, please. So what does the guidance include? It's mainly talking to local authorities, actually in large part about how they can use the flexibility in DSG funding, but we also heard really clearly from the sector that some more information was needed on how the coronavirus jobs retention scheme worked, particularly alongside DSG funding. So it's not just something which is just for local authorities or just for providers, it is a bit of a blend across both. It's worth saying a point about acronyms from central government. When DFE talks about DSG funding, it stands first of all for Dedicated Schools Funding, DSG, Dedicated Schools Grant, and it's the block of money which pays for all schools, early years and high needs money that gets pushed out to local authorities or to schools. As you will know, when it is paid to providers and is within local authorities, it's more usually referred to as free entitlement funding, FEEE funding, or EYNFF funding. All those terms are basically referring to the same thing here. I tend to call it DSG because that's what it's called when it's within the department. In other words, that's the phase where I'm responsible for it, but it's the same thing that we're talking about, public money that's trying to buy the entitlements. Next slide, please. So DFE announced early, as I said, that we'd continue paying early years funding to councils. That's still the case. That's the 3.6 billion a year, which is often referred to by central government. However, that money, although it's a big pot, is spread pretty thinly across lots of providers in any given area, and some of those will have closed. So again, in order to be providing the childcare for the children I've mentioned, you might have, in many cases, nurseries open and places normally paid for by that entitlement funding, but the children who'd normally be in the places are at home on lockdown. So a council can move those vulnerable children or children of critical workers into those empty places, which we can say have been paid for already by DSG funding or free entitlement funding. It may be that that doesn't always work and that a council is still finding it hard to secure childcare for those children in nurseries that are open. And so what the flexibility in this guidance is setting out is that a council can move some entitlements funding away from settings that are closed to ones that are open. And they're looking after these priority kids, but they are struggling financially to keep doing so. It's really worth mentioning the only when other options are exhausted line. So just to explain a little bit more about these other options, which some will be very familiar with, others perhaps less so. So councils use the rules that DFE sets them to set the local hourly funding rate, including supplements and so on. They can choose to hold back a small proportion of the DSG funding that we give them as what's called a contingency fund. And it's worth saying the department does keep an eye on local authorities about how much they're putting in contingency fund each year. Local authorities are also allowed to hold back 5% of that total pot of funding in order to deliver their central spend, their central services. So that's usually things like your early years staff, your early years team, and it might be some specialist support for SEND, for example, that providers in the area can access. So that's two pots of money where we say if either of those two pots of money still have anything unallocated in them, so in other words, anything that can legitimately be called spare, then we'd expect the council to use that first. So we're really saying only if all of those options are exhausted should this flexibility be kicking in. So next slide, please. So where a council has reached the point of needing to move DSG around, and let's assume they've discussed it with their providers, that's clear within the guidance as well, then they can redetermine payments it is strictly within section regulation 16 of the schools and early years finance regulations. For local authorities who need a bit more detail, that's all set out in the guidance. Where the funding is moved around, the intention of the guidance, the intention of the way in which we're putting two packages of support together, is that the overall package of support for any individual provider stays basically the same as before the funding was moved around. So what that means is if a nursery who is closed sees their income reduced in order to move money to a provider that's open, then that means that they can look at whether that's made the proportion of their salary bill that they can look at furloughing and claiming through the CJRS, the Coronavirus Jobs Retention Scheme, whether they can increase that a bit. So it's trying to apply sort of seesaw effect, if you like. If your funding goes down on one side, then your support on the other side will be able to go up. There's not a perfect balance that we can achieve through this, but the principle is that where one goes up, then the other goes down, and vice versa. So it's about trying to balance that income. Or it's not quite income, is it? It's support. So there's a lot of guidance, there's a lot of words in the guidance about providers accessing the Coronavirus Jobs Retention Scheme. There are conditions about how you can access that. That's all set out really clearly. They're a bit duplicative, it must be said, but there are conditions which are applying to the whole of the education sector, which is why they don't all look as if they apply to early years. There's lots more of sort of detailed wording in the guidance on that, but that's the principle. It is about trying to apply that balancing effect across DSG, removing or being gained, versus how many staff you're able to furlough and thus claim the support. So next slide, please. This, just to note actually in passing, that the eligibility for the free entitlements hasn't changed. There are no new children who can be paid for with DSG funding, excepting the next slide, which I'll come to in just a moment. So the children who are currently entitled to the government-funded free entitlements, it is a subset of those children that we're talking about here. So it's vulnerable children and children of critical workers who are already receiving entitlements. We haven't broadened who actually can access them, except for, next slide, please. This is a very, very niche and specific change in eligibility for purely the period of this crisis. This is something which shouldn't affect providers at all. It's just for local authorities, and DfE will reimburse councils for the extra costs associated with them. More detail in the guidance. And next slide, please. So the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. The aim of this guidance, the aim of the guidance which talks about how nurseries can access the Coronavirus Jobs Retention Scheme and how that fits alongside their continued receipt of the free entitlement funding or DSG funding, the principle there is to prevent double funding. So in other words, it is to protect the public purse from paying out twice for the same costs. That's a real challenge to get that right for the benefit of the public purse for everyone, but also to make it fair and simple. The Coronavirus Jobs Retention Scheme is designed to protect jobs, to keep people in employment. It's not designed to protect the total costs of any business, and early years is no different in that regard to any other employer. So when we were looking at how DSG funding, continued DfE funding, sits alongside how employers can furlough their staff and how they can access that support from the CJRS, what we needed to aim for was for simplicity. So we needed to look at a fair way to recognise that some of nurseries' usual income is gone. That's parent fees, other private income, it might be charges you might usually make to parents and so on, but some of it is continuing. That's the DSG income. So we tried to look at where the gap in that income is and to apply the gap in that income to the proportion of the pay bill that can then, the salary bill that can then be furloughed. I think I've got a little bit more later in the slides on that. Just to mention in terms of wider support, there is other support other than DSG funding and the Coronavirus Jobs Retention Scheme, which is available to many businesses, and some of it particularly for nurseries. So some early years settings will be eligible for the business rates holiday for 1 year. Some of them who are already too small to pay business rates. So that's in receipt of small business rates relief or rural rates relief. Then you can be eligible for a grant, small business grant, associated with that. There is actually a very good tool on gov.uk, which is included in the links at the end of these slides. It's called something like the Coronavirus Business Support finder or something like that. And you can follow that through to check everything that you may be eligible for. I have followed that through a few times. I think it's really pretty good. So it is worth just checking that everything that you might be eligible for, that you have at least tested the possibilities there. The other note that's mentioned on this slide to do with the job retention scheme is to do with February. And I think there were quite a few questions about February. Really happy to go into those in a bit more detail, just to help to clarify. The reason we've used February as the starting point in the calculation about how you do this balancing act of how many staff you can furlough is, firstly, it's in line with the whole of the coronavirus job retention scheme policy. And the principle there and the principle here is that February is the closest normal month before the effects of the virus started to hit. So it was before children started not attending on the basis of either sickness or very natural concern about sickness. It's not, there are things about February that make it a bit odd. So half terms, the fact that some local authorities will pay out on a termly basis. So the point about February is that it's the best approximation and the closest point in time that we have for something that is going to look normal before the effects of the virus. So there's a little bit more in the guidance about February, and I think I can come on to a bit more in that in one or two of the questions that have been asked. The next slide, please. So we've included in here, and this is in the guidance as well, the things that local authorities should consider when going back to this idea about flexing DSG funding, the sorts of things that they should consider there. This is stuff that I've already said, but basically the primary priority is sufficient childcare for the children who we need to be in childcare, which I think is a view widely shared. But that we do want them to have a view to the longer term financial sustainability, both of their early years sector locally and of course the individual nurseries that they're interacting with. And that's why it's important. It's part of a conversation and it's not something done to providers, it is done with providers, as far as everyone is able to do, recognising times are challenging at the moment. So everyone is doing their best, but that's certainly part of the aims that we want to encourage everyone to be following. And then next slide, please. So this is, again, about local authorities using the flexibility to move their DSG funding. I talked just now about the principles there, doing it with providers. It's worth just always reiterating to local authorities here, as indeed we are doing directly with local authorities, for them to consider the value of the DSG money that they are moving from or to any individual provider. So, for example, if the value of the money that's being moved around is equal to a whole salary, then that's going to be more sustainable for a business that allows them to furlough or unfurlough a whole person, as opposed to taking small amounts from several providers, meaning that none of them can furlough or unfurlough a member of staff. And then on to the next slide, which I think is Matthew asking me some questions.
Emily, thank you for that incredibly clear explanation of what is a complex area. I think it's incredibly useful for people to understand some of the thinking that's gone on, and you've also given people some practical advice as well. So definitely you've done a great job. You stressed it a few times throughout your presentation. But it was by far our most popular question. So I will just ask it, what are those, one more time, those exceptional circumstances where an LA can redistribute the DSG?
We haven't defined them. There's no legal definition, but I would say that a fair sort of assessment would be if everything else has been considered or tried first and there is a vulnerable child or a critical worker child who needs childcare, and without some movement of DSG, they will be left without it.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, now we got quite a few questions like this. This is a question about a very specific circumstance. If a local authority needs to use the flexibility, how would they manage it for a group of nurseries where one of the settings is closed, but some of the staff and the children have moved to an open setting that's part of the same group?
I've heard some of these sorts of questions as well. I mean, central government cannot answer all of those sorts of very specific questions, and for good reason, because we're not well placed to do so. Local authorities are better placed to do so, and so that's why what this guidance is doing is guiding local authorities on the principles that we want them to be using and operating when they're making these sorts of decisions. So I will unhelpfully not answer the question, but say it is right that this is for local authorities to be dealing with these very specific local issues.
I think that's a completely fair answer, Emily. We have a couple of questions from providers now on the sort of fundings they can expect. So if a setting is closed, are they still able to receive their usual entitlements funding for those children who have taken up a place in a different setting that is still open?
Well, the funding, your funding should continue as it has done. And that's because when we first announced the continuation of our DSG funding to local authorities, then we said we wanted local authorities to follow the spirit of that, essentially, which is to say, to be funding as if this were not happening to the best of their ability. So that will always depend very much on local circumstances, what was intended and so on. So in other words, what was happening should be the thing that continues to happen, unless your local authority approaches you to say, do you know what, we've got to make some flexes and some moving around in the DSG according to these principles that we've been setting out here. So there's nothing in here which should lead a provider to feel as if there is anything automatically going to change or going to happen to their funding arrangements.
Brilliant, thanks. And then it may be a similar answer, but another question from a provider we've got here is another setting remains open and is taking funded children from a closed setting. Can they access the extra DSG funding for the extra children, given that they're not able to use the CJRS?
Some providers are taking children into places that the council is effectively already paying for with DSG funding, so that they're places which you can consider prepaid but not in use. Councils will handle this differently. So again, this is about setting out the principles in this guidance about how council should be considering moving DSG funding from one provider to another.
Perfect, thank you. Now we've got a question about the conditions that need to be met in order to access the CJRS. Do staff need to meet all the conditions set out in the guidance, or just one?
They do need to meet all of them, but as I think I mentioned earlier, the conditions are written to apply to the whole range of the education sector. So they're in a piece of guidance which actually runs all the way through from early years through to postgrad, I don't know, university level education. And I think some of them look a bit duplicative when you're applying them from an early years point of view. So what you find actually is that if you've met one of them, you've probably met two of the others almost in the same breath, but they all do need to apply. Yeah.
Thanks, Emily. And my final question for this section, what measures is the department or the Treasury putting in place to monitor the interaction between the DSG and the CJRS?
So applications for the CJRS are made through an HMRC portal. So applicants are responsible for ensuring they have followed the guidance and that the information they've provided there is accurate.
Okay, fair enough, thank you. Right, back to you, Emily.
Okay, so how can providers calculate the eligibility for the coronavirus jobs retention scheme? It's important to say here that the scheme is not just sort of handing out money on a simplistic calculation. You need to identify the number of people you are furloughing, and they need to be whole, complete people who have a PAYE number. Let's move on though to the next slide, which has got a basic worked example. So we're saying this is a very basic worked example. It's just setting out the principle. It doesn't cover all of the nuance and detail that you will want to take into account in making these decisions, but it is trying to set out the principles here. So I won't read it all through, but the key things to say here are work out your usual public versus private income, and where you need to make sensible adjustments to make February a true usual position. So, for example, if the council pays termly in January, attribute the appropriate amount for February, or if you close during half term, make sensible adjustments to make February into a true representative month. So you've now worked out a proportion of public versus private income. Apply that proportion to your total salary bill, and you can furlough staff whose salaries add up to the amount of your salary bill that is that proportion that is usually the total private income that you get. You will still receive 80% of each of those staff members' salaries, and you need to pass that in full to the members of staff who have been furloughed. And then next slide, please.
Back to questions, Emily. It is really helpful to have a worked example, and we did receive lots of very provider specific questions. It's not really for the department to be providing advice to individual businesses, but we are going to try and cover some of the broad themes in these questions. So if a provider has lost their private income due to closure, can the entitlements funding be used to pay their bills and the staff payment covered via the CJRS?
Well, it's providers to decide in a normal way how they would organise their bills, but it is not possible to furlough more staff than add up to the proportion of their salary bill that's the same as the overall proportion of their income, which is usually non-public. Thank you, Emily.
If a setting has shown profit between September 2019 and February 2020, would they be expected to use those funds first rather than going through the furlough process?
There's nothing in the overall CJRS guidance from HMRC which makes reference to profit for any sector.
Thank you, it's very clear. We'll take another example. This setting has 24 funded children and 6 paying privately, i.e. a total of 30. Are they right in thinking that those 6 children equal 20% of their funding, so they would claim 20% of the CJRS support?
So I've thought about this one in advance. Right, it depends upon the proportion of the income that those privately funded children represent relatively. So if this setting charges more for parent paid hours than the local authority funding rate pays, then it won't be as simple as the above. And likewise, if these 30 children are a mix of babies, 2-year-olds and 3- and 4-year-olds who have different ratios and therefore different costs associated and usually different fee ratios, and certainly free entitlements pay different levels for 2-, and 3- and 4-year-olds. If these were all 3- and 4-year-olds and parents paid exactly the same per hour as that setting receives from the local authority per hour, then the nursery could consider that 20% of their income was non-public, so they could identify staff salaries that add up to no greater than 20% of their salary bill and furlough those members of staff. And subject, of course, to all usual good management processes, so consultation, conversation, and so on. I won't get into that now, but of course, all of that should always apply.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for taking the time to sort of think that one through. Yes. Should settings only pay their employees the percentage of their salaries they're receiving through the CJRS support, for example, 46 rather than the 80%?
No, an employer claims for 80% of the staff salary through the CJRS and need to pass that on in full. More detail in the CJRS guidance from HMRC on all of that.
Perfect. Do the calculations include on costs, pensions, NI, benefits, etc.?
All of that. I think the best place to go is the HMRC guidance. It's not an early years specific question, so I won't tread on their toes.
Thank you. Very wise, Emily. Should employers complete a furlough application each month, as the proportion of their pay bill could vary?
I think there again need to refer to the CJRS guidance, but early years, it's the same for early years as any other employer. The only difference for early years in terms of new applications Are there rare circumstances where local authorities might be moving DSG funding either to or from your setting?
Thanks, Emily. That was the final question for that round. So a few more slides and then into the final stretch.
Okay, thank you. So moving staff off their current 3-week furlough, that's quite hard to say. We've heard that the 3-week minimum furlough has been a worry for people. We have heard that loud and clear, and we have actually raised this a lot. It's not possible to change it because the CJRS has to work for every business in the country, and we couldn't get an early years sector specific carve out from it. And even if we had, it would have just become impossible for HMRC to deliver on it. So worth just saying, we really did hear that, and we really did just make sure that point was heard loud and clear in other areas as well. I mean, we hear about a lot of these concerns through sector representatives, sector representative bodies. We raise them where we can. We absolutely try and resolve what we can. The pace of the work here has been really challenging, and some things have taken longer than we would have liked. And there isn't much more to say about the 3-week furlough. So then next slide, please, which is powers. Powers to require settings to open or reopen under the Coronavirus Act 2020. So this was something which was part of the emergency legislation, which now feels a long time ago. This is not a new thing since the Coronavirus Act 2020. There's nothing new that we've introduced. They're not currently in use anywhere.
Thanks, Emily. We now have some questions about financial support available to specific types of early year settings. So could you let us know what's on offer for maintained nursery schools, please?
So guidance is clear on this. The CJRS guidance is clear. So maintained nursery schools, of course, are legally schools. In this instance, then we assessed that they were better off being treated as if they were essentially private early years providers, in that they have a mix of public and private income. So all of the same rules apply to them as would do for any nursery with a mix of public private, in that they can furlough staff up to the proportions as I've described previously. School-based nurseries aren't included within this. They are covered separately, or schools are covered separately within the whole CJRS guidance for the education sector.
Perfect, thank you. And what about providers who rent their premises, please, Emily?
Yes, so obviously not benefiting from the rates relief for those who are located in their own premises and subject to business rates. So some settings operate from shared spaces, and some of those shared spaces may now be benefiting from rates relief, some of them 100% rates relief. So government has signalled that we strongly encourage those shared spaces, or the landlords of those shared spaces, to reflect any business rate saving in their rent charges. So we're encouraging that.
And then we've got one final question, which isn't totally related, but you knew it was coming, and it really is one of our really, it would be great for the sector to hear from you. What consideration is being given to recovery, and in particular whether providers what sort of advance notice about reopening dates will you be able to provide?
Well, so obviously this isn't for an official to say. This is for ministers and indeed the Prime Minister to get into the full detail of this sort of thing. As you would expect and hope, then we are considering this. At the moment, as at 1st of May, still at relatively early stages, just really as a result of the huge amounts of work that were happening to try and organise all the different recovery packages just as the crisis hit. So we've definitely turned to face towards the future now, and really investing a huge amount of time and thought, and as again you would expect, conversations very widely across government with obviously ministers, also with sector representatives and local authorities are planned as well. And ministers and officials are well aware of the need for all parts of the economy and the education sector, including nurseries, to know what's coming and be able to plan.
Thank you, Emily. And that was the final question. So it's now only down to me to thank you. The amount of thought that clearly you and your team have put into, coming up with solutions to what is a really complex set of issues really shines through. The preparation that you put into this webinar really shines through. So we really, really appreciate you joining us and helping get the Foundation Years community the answers they need. Thank you to all of you for watching and for submitting your questions in advance. We can't promise you personalized answers, but if you are experiencing further problems, do let us know via the Foundation Years inbox, and we are passing those on to the Department for Education. Finally, as I said at the beginning, if you'd like to join the Foundation Years community and you haven't already done so, please visit our website. You can sign up for more information about Vodcast, regular updates during COVID-19 and beyond. Thanks everyone, and see you next time.